So, to start things off, the protagonist of Buchi Emechita's novel, The Second Class Citizen, a woman who had never truly felt desired, loved, or beautiful, reflects that she had never thought that black could be beautiful until she read James Baldwin. This could not be a more fitting start to introducing this morning's speaker. Michel Chaouli teaches literature and philosophy at Indiana University Bloomington. His book, Thinking with Kant's Critique of Judgment, published by Harvard University Press in 2017, is a stunning meditation on encountering the artwork. In his forthcoming book, Something Speaks to Me, Where Criticism Begins, that will be published by Chicago University Press next year, he develops the idea and the practice of poetic criticism. Michel has received several prestigious fellowships and held several prestigious academic positions. He is a phenomenal and astute scholar, a Germanist, a fellow comparatist, whose work for me emphasizes the enduring questions of meaning and beauty, and the fact that while they may be philosophical in nature, they need not be articulated in obscure and obfuscated ways. Their complexities are precisely the complexities of the everydayness of human experience. It gives me great joy to introduce Michel, and like the rest of us here, I look forward to his talk on a writer and thinker whose work has personally been very meaningful to me. Could we give him a round of applause?
Delighted to be given the opportunity to think with you here, where I feel the space of thinking is different. I don't know if it's larger, but it's certainly different from what I'm accustomed to. And so that's one of the great intellectual experiences also of being here. You seem very far away. I know the feeling. I also would always like to have an escape route when I'm at a lecture, but I would not mind if you decided to leave early. But you do. So if you feel like it, if it's not inconveniencing you, come closer. It will feel a bit more. Thank you. I hope I'm not doing violence to you. So the gist of my talk is really very simple. It is that I don't really make a distinction between writer and critic. And I'll tell you why, very briefly. And activism is simply in the nature of what's done. It just depends on what you mean by activism. So I think of it simply as a form of making criticism. Is a kind of making. It's not passive, it's not a response, it's not just contemplation, but a kind of making. So really for me, these terms on the simplest level make all the sense in the world. So I'll tell you a little bit what I mean by this. So I want to tell you about a mishap that I had while teaching Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial, a few years ago. The basics are quickly summarized. After reading out loud a passage that I had chosen because it had seemed especially rich, I found that I had nothing to say about it. Nothing. I tried finessing things by reading it a second time. Still nothing. Panic rising, I skipped to another passage that I had marked and read it to the class, and then another, always with the same outcome. This was unnerving. I had set off on a path, the path of analysis and interpretation, the path I knew or thought I knew. I had taught this book many times before. only to find myself repeatedly led back to my starting point, to Kafka's words themselves. It was a bit like walking into a story by Kafka, a story like an imperial message. It's a simple story. A messenger rushes to get a message from the dying emperor to you. Yes, you. Yet despite his swiftness, despite his resolve, he never manages to leave the palace, much less cross the vast expanse of the empire to reach you. Like the trial, and so much of Kafka's writings, this story too is pervaded by the feeling that a character's efforts at moving forward result in nothing but futility and exhaustion. It's a feeling we know from bad dreams, and one I came to know in front of my class. Try as I may, I found no way to deliver the message. I've often returned to that moment, and not without dread, since the burn of humiliation never quite heals. I actually feel it even now as I'm recounting this to you. It's strange. It was years ago. One reason to revisit it may be that I soon felt, or perhaps hoped, that the scene betrayed something more than my own shortcoming, that being tongue-tied was not my lot alone, but spoke to a shared condition, the condition of criticism. I felt and hoped that my failure to speak was mute testimony to a general difficulty in saying something that could stand up to the experience of reading the passages from the trial, the difficulty of criticism, I would just say. Most things that I encounter in the world do not impel me to speak about them. When I hold, let's say, a spoon, without saying something about it, as I did this morning at breakfast, I do not feel an absence, a void aching to be filled, a stutter pounding against an invisible barrier, and not because there's nothing to say about it. An inquiry into the spoon need not be less demanding than examining a work by Franz Kafka. When I take the spoon for granted and credit it with indifferent silence, as I do every day, I do lose something. I deprive myself of the knowledge of its place in history and miss out on the pleasure of noticing just how elegant a device this piece of flatware is. But that is not essential to the relationship we have, the spoon and I. Telling its story, singing its praises, or enumerating its flaws is something I do for my own sake or for the sake of others, not something the spoon asks of me. If it can be said to ask anything of me, it is to use it, to stir the broth or tap the soft-boiled egg. So I use it. As a rule, the spoon does not call on me to grapple with its significance, which is why, as a rule, I do not feel the urge to put it down and tell you about it. Yet when holding a book that speaks to me, that is just what I feel, the urge to put it down and tell you. And when I then fail, my silence feels different from the one with which I greet the spoon. Now my silence consists not in the mere absence of words, but has a volume and mass all its own. I feel the pressure of words I'm not uttering. These are not words I know and have chosen to hold back the way I decide to keep a secret. They are words whose surging force I feel, yet whose shape and character elude me. Because I require them to give shape to my experience, their remaining out of reach means that my own experience fails me. What just happened to me? Did anything happen? It comes down to this. Something speaks to me. I must tell you about it, but I don't know how. That is the heart of it, the heart of criticism and its difficulty, no matter its form, no matter its refinement. I watch, I hear, I read something, and suddenly there is an overflow of beauty or of some feeling or thought that is too much for me, and for some reason, I need you to know.
but I don't know what exactly to say or how, which is all the more reason why I need to tell you. Reading or watching or listening, I feel called. I also feel called upon to tell you, because only in telling you do I have a chance to learn how. Only once I've managed to share it with you, once I've ceded it to a domain beyond myself, do I come to think that it was mine, this experience, that it was mine all along. The need to tell you is really the need to discover what I think of as my own experience. One thing to hold on to then, criticism worth writing and reading, criticism worth saying and hearing, does not provide a transcript of an encounter with a work that lies in the past. It is not the eulogy for an experience that has been put to rest. Rather, this criticism is poetic. Parasitic though it may be, belated though it may be, poetic criticism makes something. It produces, which is just what poetic means at root. Seen this way, the poetic and the critical, the writer and the critic, must lead a hyphenated existence, and when they don't, something has gone awry. There are many questions to be asked here. Do I know why certain things speak to me but not to others? Some books or pictures say, but very few spoons. Do I know when this urge to speak arises? Why did it well up yesterday but not today? And why to you but not to me? When I tell you, does it have to be you I tell? Or could it be anyone? Or no one? In the next half hour or so, I'd like to stay with one question. How does it happen that something comes to speak to me? Is it not mysterious? Is it not profoundly strange that the words scribbled in the dead of night by a German-speaking Jew in Prague would, 100 years later, render me speechless while I stand before a group of undergraduates in Bloomington, Indiana? What business do I have with Kafka's words, and what they with me? Where does the claim they have on me come from? Do they belong to me, or I to the lineage in which they stand? Does this lineage extend to Bloomington? If I find that Kafka speaks to me on this fine April day in this hall, have I felt and thought something real, or have I deluded myself? Put another way, I wish to ask about the history that pervades my encounter with something that speaks to me, and the politics. Ask then about the history and politics of poetic criticism. I will do so by triangulating two thinkers of strikingly different temperament and formation, namely Hans-Georg Gadamer and James Baldwin, mainly Baldwin. A student of Martin Heidegger's, Gadamer was among the most influential philosophers, the most influential German philosophers, I should say, of the post-war. His masterpiece, Truth and Method, puts forward a rigorous conception of hermeneutics. James Baldwin was one of the foremost African-American writers of the 20th century. He would have said Negro writers. He wrote novels and essays and polemics. His language was shaped not by Heidegger, but by the rhythms of the Black church. The two dwell at a great distance from one another, yet there are good reasons, I think, to think with them together. And what better place to do so than at yet another great distance, here in Delhi, in your company. Return then to the experience with which I began. Something speaks to me. I use the pronoun in its singular form, something speaks to me, because poetic power lies in the singularity of the work. But the singular can also mislead. It can mislead us into imagining that the work and I meet in happy isolation from the rest of the world. A work can speak to me in its singularity only because it appears against a plural background. Kafka's Trial hardly ever comes out of nowhere. And if it did, it would probably not mean anything to me. It comes wrapped in layers of cultural significance which themselves change with time. That is a way of saying that the way a work speaks to me and the way I find a response, or don't, is not only social but also historical. This is related to the more established idea that the knowledge at stake in the humanities is historical knowledge, which is really the gist of hermeneutics. This school of thought teaches that objects of historical knowledge are not objects the way atoms or tectonic plates are, or at least thought to be, not because the one has a temporal dimension that the other lacks. Scientists know that their undertaking has a history. They also know, or could know if they wished, that the conception of truth has a history, along with its supporting cast of objectivity, proof, experiment, and all the rest. But that is a history of science, not a history in science. Yet hermeneutics teaches that being in history is precisely what is true of the humanities. Its knowledge does not just have a history, but it is historical. How are we to imagine this? Being in time is not the same thing as being in history. And historicity, in other words, being structured by history, is as distinct from temporality as it is from chronology. History requires events to be articulated according to a narrative logic. This logic can take many forms, but no matter its form, it uses the language of motivation, of intention and purpose. To be able to say something about a historical object, an object in history, in other words, I must have an idea about the knot of motivations, intentions, and purposes that has brought it about, and the knot to which it leads, which is just what I'm called to avoid when giving an account of a planet's orbit or a virus's spread. That is one dimension of the historicity of the humanities. There's another, more profound way in which humanistic knowledge is structured historically, and it is this. To be able to understand something in its historical dimension, I must also understand myself as a historical being. Historical knowledge is not something to be arrived at from a position of detachment. I'm not an observer, aloof from what implicates me in the world, but myself a participant in the world. That means that my encounter cannot help but be lodged where I find myself at any given moment, namely here, now. My encounter with a work and my account of this encounter, therefore, inevitably differs from other such encounters, yours, for example, embedded as they are in situations different from mine. It is for this reason, and not because allegedly we know more, that criticism and historiography are open-ended enterprises. Gadamer has written, and here's my first quote, "Whoever conducts historical studies is always also determined by the fact that he himself experiences history. History is always written anew because the present determines us." History, I highlight this for you, history determines us. The present determines us. We pronounce these words easily, blithely, as though we had pulled them from inside a fortune cookie, forgetting how heady they are and how frightening. Are all my encounters with others, with things, with myself, determined by the present, which itself is determined by history? And determined how? When I find that a line from Kafka speaks to me, is that thanks to my history? And I put my in quotation marks, in scare quotes. What does it mean, my history? And if it fails to touch me, then also, what wiggle room does history leave me in making the encounter? Poetic criticism is singular, yet this singularity is, and this is an important point for me, this singularity is impersonal. Society courses through it, and so does history. What does that mean? Gadamer has thought deeply about these questions, so let's stay with him just for a moment longer. The reason the task of historical embedment is important to Gadamer is that it has a direct link to what he calls the business of the historical humanities, whose bottom line, he tells us, is understanding the utterances of the past, or as he likes to put it, the fusion of the horizon of the present with the horizon of the past, the fusion of the horizon of the present with the horizon of the past. Without history, no understanding, and without understanding, the humanities are out of business, he says. For understanding to succeed, it does not suffice that I place both the object, in scare quotes, the object of inquiry, Kafka, and myself into history. A further condition must be met. I must also understand us as being part of the same history. Otherwise, the enterprise of the fusion of horizons runs aground, for you cannot fuse what is completely unlike. The works of the past could speak as loudly as they wished. My ears would remain deaf to their call. Perhaps that is why the monuments from the Maya civilization leave me cold. They are stupendous and they are dazzling. They must have been immensely significant to the people who built and used them, even to those who dreaded them, to them especially. I squint at them in the glare of the bright day and dare not confess to myself that I am at a loss. I have no idea what they want from me. Then, like everyone else, I pull out my phone and take pictures. These edifices leave me perplexed, yet it is an untroubled perplexity, one that swiftly yields to curiosity and soothes itself with information, the perplexity of a tourist. Gadamer would say that I fail to understand because I fail to share a history with a world in which these structures are meaningful. It is an incomprehension born of thin intimacy. But, and Gadamer does not say this often enough, that does not mean that the inverse, thick intimacy, nurtured by my sense that my history links me to the work speaking to me, allows me to hear it the way it wishes to be heard. Sharing a history does not always put me on the path of understanding. Being in the same history does not make us, the work and me, into allies who move in lockstep. We are more like friends, intimate strangers, really. Intimacy, while enabling comprehension, also sharpens the edge of incomprehension. It changes the texture of non-understanding, perhaps more drastically even than that of understanding. Now I fail to understand, say Kafka again, now I fail to understand not because I fail to know the code, or because I've committed an error in the arithmetic of decipherment, but because another way of being has left me dumbfounded. How different the incomprehension born of thick intimacy is when compared to the bafflement I feel before the Maya structures. Because I face the strangeness of something I know from inside, it finds a way of getting under my skin. That helps us, but it also raises its own questions. Let us grant Gadamer the point that a work becomes significant to me only when I take it to be involved in the same history in which I find myself. But what does sameness mean? What qualifies as being part of the same history and what not? Suppose I attend a flamenco performance, By the lights of hermeneutic theory, I remain insensible to it if I do not find myself in an unbroken chain of historical causes and effects linking me to the event. But under which conditions do I come to stand at the end of a chain that somewhere down the line has flamenco as one of its links? Only if I have lived my life under the Andalusian sun? What if I've moved there from a pale and gloomy place? What if I'm a devotee of flamenco, study it, sing it, and dance it passionately, but in Indiana or in India? Does it really speak to me then, or do I merely imagine that? Millions of people on this globe are moved to sincere tears of sorrow by the diary of Anne Frank. Is it because they are in the same history as that work? Gadamer seeks to solve the riddle of historical continuity with the notion of tradition, a term that came up yesterday, I think, in Vidyan's talk. My tradition, one of your quotes said. So he seeks to solve this with the notion of tradition. It is tradition, he thinks, what issues the warrant for being spoken to by the past. He writes, "Our usual relationship to the past is not characterized by distancing and freeing ourselves from tradition. Rather, we're always situated within traditions, plural now, and this is no objectifying process. That is, we do not conceive of tradition, we do not conceive of what tradition says as something other, something alien. It is always part of us, and we part of it, we could say. Tradition is not something I choose. I'm part of it, and it part of me. It is not something alien, but woven into my being. It governs what becomes significant to me." Has tradition made the question of historical filiation less mysterious? Difficult to say. I find the paintings in the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet unutterably powerful. Is it that they and I are part of a tradition? If so, which? Hardly the tradition of European painting. Well, what then? The tradition of using color? The tradition of making significant marks? The tradition of loving beautiful things? If these are traditions, then there would not seem to exist any human act to which I'm not bound by some tradition. Besides, if tradition is to be credited or to be blamed for what binds me to the cave paintings, then how has it happened that a bond to something so impossibly remote has escaped damage, while the Maya monuments, not to mention countless other works far closer in space and time, have slipped away, if ever they did belong to my tradition? The worry here is that tradition may be a substance with properties so shape-shifting that as a concept it may be incoherent. One moment it is elastic enough to bind me to Paleolithic life, and the next its rigidity keeps me from gaining purchase on some things that are close at hand. Not to mention the fact that a musty and conservative air clings to it. Would scrapping it help? To be replaced by what? How to give texture to the intimate bond that mysteriously establishes itself between a work and me, and that, with luck, yields criticism that is poetic? How to describe that texture to account for the fact, equally mysterious, that sometimes a bond is prevented from forming? What hides in plain view of the concept of tradition, also of its substitutes, namely history, culture, identity, these are all rubbery concepts that do kind of the same work. So what hides in plain view of these is a conundrum that is at bottom not philosophical but political. These concepts adjudicate who and under what provisos is entitled to have a certain kind of experience and who is not. They decide, they exist to decide who and what makes part of a tradition, part of a history, part of a culture, part of an identity, and who and what does not. If for reasons of tradition or of history, culture, blah, 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 I am judged to have no business with Kafka's writings or with the horses galloping away on the walls of the Chauvet cave or the pyramid at Uxmal, then I'm out of luck. Whatever counterclaim I make will be brushed off as illegitimate or immoral or delusional unless, and that's a big unless, I manage to bring about a shift in the concept of tradition, in the concept of history or culture or identity, in a way that legitimates and therefore accommodates this move. What is at stake then in the politics of hearing and of speaking, which is also the politics of criticism, is not whether my claim to having been spoken to having heard something, and to speaking is granted or refused, but rather how to shape the adjudicating conception so as to grant or refuse the claim. That's the politics of it. Look, for instance, at how James Baldwin, while on a walk in a remote Swiss village in the early 1950s, considers the inhabitants of this village. He writes, "These people cannot be, from the point of view of power, strangers anywhere in the world." He's talking about the Swiss villagers. "They have made the modern world, in effect, even if they do not know it. The most illiterate among them is related in a way that I am not to Dante, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Aeschylus, Da Vinci, Rembrandt, and Racine. The cathedral at Chartres says something to them which it cannot say to me, as indeed would New York's Empire State Building, should anyone here ever see it. Out of their hymns and dances come Beethoven and Bach. Go back a few centuries, and they are in their full glory, but I am in Africa, watching the conquerors arrive." So ferocious is the passage's intelligence, so vigorous the blow to the skull that it delivers, that it takes time, it took me years, to collect one's wits and ask, really? Is it really the case that the most illiterate of the Swiss is related to Dante and Shakespeare in a way Baldwin is not? And the answer must be yes. It is the case, provided, and now the fine print, provided you understand being related to the way Baldwin does here, namely as flowing from the blood of kinship, and provided you understand history as Baldwin does, namely as nothing but a curse whose judgment must be suffered. Baldwin tends to a tragic view of history more commonly encountered among European writers. Joyce, he writes, "Joyce is right about history being a nightmare, but it may be the nightmare from which no one can awaken. People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." And I use tragic in its original sense, for this conception of history rests directly, not on Aeschylus, but on Sophocles, as Baldwin explains elsewhere. It is a sentimental error, he writes. It is a sentimental error, therefore, to believe that the past is dead. It means nothing to say that it is all forgotten, that the Negro himself has forgotten it. It is not a question of memory. Oedipus did not remember the thongs that bound his feet. Nevertheless, the marks they left testified to that doom towards which his feet were leading him. The man does not remember the hand that struck him, the darkness that frightened him as a child. Nevertheless, the hand and the darkness remain with him, indivisible from him forever. Forever. The violence of history, the violence that is history, remains, and it remains forever. History is a nightmare from which no one, absolutely no one, can awaken. People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. Baldwin is still in Africa, while the Swiss villagers, kinsmen of what he calls the Herrenvolk, the master race, stand to receive as their patrimony the cathedral of Chartres. That is what Baldwin is saying. It is this unforgiving idea of history, of culture, of inheritance, of tradition. It is this tragic mood that attracted me to the essay and that also frightened me and frightens me still. I desperately want it not to be true. What I have made of my life is predicated on the essay not telling the truth, not the whole truth anyway. Otherwise, my experience of Kafka speaking to me, of Gadamer and indeed Baldwin speaking to me, would be nothing but delusions. The truth is that my biography has not placed me squarely among the Herrenvolk. And so I come to the works that have sustained me and also vexed me all my life, let's say to this tradition, from the side, and my access has remained oblique. It was strange to be reading Schiller and Sophocles and Ionesco's Bald Soprano in Tehran, where I went to school. You needed to be outfitted with a stretchable imagination to believe that these works were meant for us, my classmates and me. Yet it was also exhilarating because it expressed the idea that people are not forever trapped in history, at least not in a single history. It presented the possibility that even when works are not obviously addressed to me, as those works definitely were not, I can still find ways of hearing them speak. Fallacies all and lies? Baldwin's essay is not about the Swiss villagers, who are no more than extras in this production, but about himself, the stranger in the village from the title. And the village that matters to him lies not in Switzerland, but in America. It is America. Like much of his writings, this essay too is about being a stranger in America. His estrangement stems from the savage dispossession of the past exacted not only on those Africans shipped to America, but also on their descendants, including those who centuries later find themselves strolling in the Alps. But as Baldwin does not tire of repeating, this is an estrangement not from America, but an estrangement in America. The stranger makes America, and America, in turn, makes the stranger. This is the point where the essay, Baldwin's, opens a door to me. Not that harmony has suddenly been established and horizons have fused. Not that I now feel Baldwin's pain. Not that suffering has been revealed to be a universal condition of humanity. Rather, I'm able to see in Baldwin's and in America's strangeness some of the strangeness that prevails between the tradition and myself. And since tradition is silently part of me, that means in effect that I'm able to see and to feel some of the strangeness in myself. Baldwin's words resonate most with me, not when they dislodge him from the West and place him in Africa, but when they acknowledge him to be what he terms a bastard of the West. Now I see that his history and his passions, so evidently running athwart tradition, renew and remake tradition. Here is the passage from an autobiographical essay in which he seeks to sort out the question of birth and of birthright. It's a longish passage. The most crucial time in my own development came when I was forced to recognize that I was a kind of bastard of the West. When I followed the line of my past, I did not find myself in Europe, but in Africa. And this meant that in some subtle way, in a really profound way, I brought to Shakespeare, Bach, Rembrandt, to the stones of Paris, to the cathedral at Chartres, and to the Empire State Building a special attitude. All of the objects that we know from the Swiss essay, which is decades earlier. A special attitude. These were not really my creations. They did not contain my history. I might search in them in vain forever for any reflection of myself. I was an interloper. This was not my heritage. Here's another term that does some of that work, heritage. At the same time, I had no other heritage which I could possibly hope to use. I had certainly been unfitted for the jungle or the tribe. I would have to appropriate these white centuries. I would have to make them mine. I would have to accept my special attitude, my special place in this scheme. Otherwise, I would have no place in any scheme. This recognition that he speaks about, which, as he says, is a forced recognition, this forced recognition that he must appropriate these white centuries, must take possession of what he knows not to be his creations, goes hand in hand with another recognition, likely also forced, that he, as he writes, is not a visitor to the West, but a citizen there, an American as the Americans who despise him. He's speaking of himself in the third person. The Americans who fear him, the Americans who love him. These two recognitions are claims to appropriation. One, a cultural appropriation, Chartres, Shakespeare, Sophocles, all the rest. And the other, political appropriation, America. They lead, 30 years after this, the Stranger in the Village essay, to a reflection on the power of history that leaves behind the mythic idea of history as tragic inevitability and cracks open a space that accommodates the act of making for myself a special place in this scheme, as he says. It is 1984 when Baldwin, now 60, writes, "I am what time, circumstance, history have made me, certainly, but I am also much more than that. So are we all." Yes, all of us are made by history, by tradition, by culture, by identity, heritage, take your pick, but we're not made by these entirely. There is much more than that. But you do not need to read Baldwin to know, though when you read him it is hard to forget, that all of us are not composed of the same ratio of history and what is much more than history. All of us are bastards of history, but some more so than others. Some bastards are entitled to a greater share of the patrimony, while others, dispossessed, find themselves urged to make more of this patrimony, much more. Now I see that the idea of surpassing the history in which one finds oneself trapped is more than merely adumbrated in Stranger in the Village. Yet in my panic, I chose to overlook it. Recall that Baldwin writes that the Swiss villagers are related to Dante, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and the rest in a way that I'm not. That's what he said, in a way that I'm not. Which now I take to mean that he too is related to these objects, but differently. The same goes for the Cathedral of Chartres. When it says something to the villagers which it cannot say to me, it does not remain mute when facing Baldwin, but speaks to him in a different tongue. And what might the cathedral say to him that it cannot say to the people of the village? Baldwin has this answer, and this is my final slide. Perhaps they are struck by the power of the spires, the glory of the windows, but they have known God, after all, longer than I have known him, and in a different way. And I'm terrified by the slippery, bottomless well to be found in the crypt, down which heretics were hurled to death, and by the obscene, inescapable gargoyles jutting out of the stone and seeming to say that God and the devil can never be divorced. I doubt that the villagers think of the devil when they face a cathedral, because they have never been identified with the devil. But I must accept the status which myth, if nothing else, gives me in the West before I can hope to change the myth. The intimacy I can have with something, with a cathedral or with Kafka or with any work, takes its form from the history that has made me and in which I find myself, the history that is my present moment. That provides me with resources, but also with limits that differ from those at the disposal of others, saddled as they are with their own histories. But, like everyone else, I do not know my present moment, cannot comprehend my resources and my limits, anyway not fully enough to give an accounting of my present ways of hearing and my ways of making. They escape and exceed me, which is why I can hear and make in ways that surpass my history and remake this history. I thank you for your attention.
I came here expecting to hear about James Baldwin, who was a very important influence in my life, and I also ended up listening about Gadamer, who's also a philosopher who's very, very dear to me. And I was thinking about the ways in which James Baldwin speaks so uncompromisingly about the questions of human dignity. But what your talk also reminded me about was bearing witness and speaking about James Baldwin speaking about these things. And in that sense, I was reminded of, or I was thinking about this idea of thrownness, and in a certain sense, what throws me also binds me in so many ways. And we cannot anticipate what throws us and why and in what ways. And I was also thinking about, when you were talking about Kafka and the spoon, I was thinking about the 17th century Japanese poet Basho, who towards the end of his life was absolutely mystified by the beauty of a plantain tree. So the everydayness of these things cannot be underestimated, and thank you for that. And with that, I open it up to questions.
Thank you so much for that flight of eloquence, and it's a pleasure to listen and an education. We were talking about keywords yesterday. Intimacy, I've been to 3 symposia in the last 5 years with that key term. I wonder if I could press you a little more on the value assigned to thick and thin intimacy, and what you understand by intimacy within the frame of Gadamer, who I haven't read for a long time, but I would like to be told more about. But also what are the advantages of thin intimacy or forced thick intimacy?
Forced.
Yes. Does that make sense to you? Could you?
Yeah, I can. I'm not sure the forced thick makes sense to me. So we can talk about it more, and then I think we'll get closer. So intimacy is a term for me. I don't think I get it from Gadamer. He may use it somewhere, but I'm not aware of it. It's not really his kind of language. So I don't believe that he uses it. But to me, it was a way of, so it's not for me something like love or even friendship, if by friendship we understand a purely harmonious relationship. I think of friends as intimate strangers, which is to say, this is the experience. I mean, even with a lover that you have, that you're constantly bumping into the recognition that you are on some level strangers. It can be quite painful, but it can also be exhilarating in different ways. So intimacy for me goes hand in hand with also incomprehension and the friction and rub that incomprehension produces. The formula that I use in my book is that intimacy is a vulnerability to significance. And this significance can take many forms, right? It can be a vulnerability to let's say, something like a warmth, but it can also be a vulnerability to injury. So a cutting remark from a close friend has a completely different force on me than some random thing on the internet that I might read. So that's how intimacy can sharpen misunderstandings or non-understandings. So the thick and thin intimacy I only brought in because I didn't want it to. I don't think of it as a binary thing, that it's either absence or presence. So when I'm in the Yucatan, as I was with my sons a couple of years ago, and gawking at these astonishing, I don't know if you've been in the presence of these, but you will have your own examples of these astonishing structures and just not knowing at all what to make of them. It's not that they've fallen from Mars, so I understand that they're human creations. Yet there is something extremely fundamental also missing between me and them, which is not their fault.
So is it a kind of Derridean thickening of a caesura that we understand difference to be not this violent binary caesura, but Derrida's very fond of thickening as a kind of way of talking about negotiating the violence of a binary.
Yeah, I, to tell you the truth, I don't know. I never feel like I fully understand what he says exactly about most things. That is, I understand it while I'm on the page, but then I lose it the moment I close the book. So that's why I never refer to it, because I don't have anything there to hang on to, and I don't want to do citation, the citation game. So I don't know. I'm happy to be educated about that. I think of it really in a very simple way as a relationship that develops, right? These things take time. They don't reading Kafka or being able to have some meaningful relationship with the pyramid of Uxmal or anything requires obviously training and a history and knowledge. So I'm not in any way dismissing any of these. Without them, we would be nowhere, right? At the same time, all of those do not guarantee in any way that I will know what is being said, as my experience with Kafka attested. It was precisely that I knew what I knew that made those texts so mysterious, as is the experience with, say, reading biblical parables. You've read them 50 times or heard them, and all of a sudden you say, wait, Abraham was doing what to Isaac? And it hits you really like a blow to the skull. And it's only because you know it well. It's not some story, but it's something you've lived with all of your life and in this history.
We have a question from Amit, and then Shumana, then Amit, and then yes, Vidyan. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, lovely. You're speaking to things which I've been kind of figuring out as well for the last 25 years, or more maybe. Just a few observations, maybe a question at the end of it. Baldwin's account of the Swiss inheritance must be a myth. I mean, I can't believe that the Swiss elite, let alone the Swiss villager, would not have questioned themselves about the naturalness of this inheritance, the European inheritance. I'm not even going towards further afield into Russia, where these questions begin to come up very productively. The question is, does it come up also in the heart of the among the inheritors, and what that produces? Bringing it to my sort of encounters I've had, I was very moved by what you said about, and found it funny as well, what you said about the Mayan structures and other encounters. So we went for a walk in Calcutta. I was showing you those houses in South Calcutta. You saw that, and somebody else might see that, as my natural inheritance. It's a very long inheritance, though, when you think about it. Those houses came up in the early 20th century. So already the idea of inheritance, when it comes to something which looks old, inherited, but is also very recent, and is an intervention rather than an inheritance, is complicated. I'm showing you those houses. I think of those houses when I go to Dubai, and I feel as baffled by you, as you do with the Mayan structures, as I do in certain kind of areas in the world, in certain neighborhoods in Dubai or Atlanta. So I'm thinking about those houses and what ties me to them. And somebody from Calcutta would say, well, you didn't grow up in Calcutta, this is not your inheritance. So there are multiple kind of vantage points that are creating a history which Baldwin might be thinking of as his own, but is partly internalizing the history which was invented to say the Swiss inherit Europe. That was created elsewhere. Do we own history? If we don't own it, so when I went to Konark for the first time, have you ever been? It's in Orissa, it's a temple. It's astonishing. It was recreated, put in place again by archaeologists. The most astonishing and profligate acts of sex are depicted in a sublime way on its walls. And also in areas of the temple where nobody can possibly notice, so you wonder what they're doing over there. And when I went there a few years ago, actually more than 10 years ago, I thought to myself, who are the people who created these sculptures? It was an interesting moment, and I've written about this, because at that time, M.F. Hussain was being attacked by the Hindu right wing for having produced these paintings, naked goddesses. And he had to be exiled, banished from this country, or self-inflicted exile, where he died in Qatar, I think. And that was the moment it began in Bombay, an exhibition of those artworks, where the Hindu right said, this is, in fact, they were saying this is not your inheritance. What are you doing with it? At that time, those temples like Konark, were being invoked by the liberal left. I think we have always been liberal, And I thought, okay, fine. It didn't completely convince me. When I went to Konark, I thought to myself, but this is not my inheritance. I can't claim it in the way the liberal left are claiming it. I am distant from it it is wondrous, but I cannot claim a natural line coming down to me from it. When I do that, I create a prototype of myself among the creators of Konarak. This dissonance in my own inheritance leads to something. It's extremely productive, even more than, I mean, as productive as a dissonance with this idea that this is their inheritance, is it mine? There are no natural inheritances. I wanted to ask you something about Picasso and the primitive. He must have been alienated by the Renaissance, by the European Renaissance, and felt intimate with what we now call, what began to be called primitive art. So.
Interesting. I'll let your comment stand. And other people want to speak. I already had a lot of time to speak, so I would be keen to hear from others. But thank you. Yes, dissonance is, or strangeness is what I called it, or you could call it separateness. All of these, I think they speak to precisely what you were speaking about. Yes, Shumana.
I've taken lots of notes. So, about concepts that you called rubbery, an adjective I'm going to use without kind of citing you. Michel, I think of two categories that you used, my and singular. And I know of your interest in poetic criticism. Because of the way you understand, and I feel close to that, your understanding of my and singular, and the fact that it is my encounter with a text, how does this then become an ism? Every critic, if this is a my encounter with a particular text, how does this become criticism, a particular school of criticism? And must everything that a critic writes belong to an ism? What happens to those who are left out by these isms?
Mm-hmm. So, thank you. So you've caught me using a term unreflectively. I am not at all attached to the ism part of criticism. I prefer criticism to critique. So in German, there is just one word for the two, which is Kritik. And in English, it's a luxury that there are two terms. And I always preferred criticism because, in fact, it seemed the flabbier and less kind of militarized term compared to critique, which always kind of frightens you when somebody arrives with a critique. But the ism part of it, I have no commitment to it. And if you can invent a term that wouldn't have this distracting final syllable, I'd be happy with it. You're absolutely right. There isn't an ism. This is a free-for-all. There are family resemblances, but there's no ism.
All right, yeah, so we'll have our last question now, I think.
I think maybe because especially since all the questions have been asked by people who've already had a chance to speak, so maybe I'll, over a drink, I'll say a lot of the things that I was going to say. So just quickly, a different thing. I guess what was probably very heartening about returning to Baldwin, and what Baldwin says there for a lot of people in the room, is that even though he has this agonized relationship with various kinds of history, Western history, he has a relation to it, or he perceives that other people have a relation to it, and that it's a kind of inheritance, that it's alive in them in some way, or it's dead in them in some kind of way. And I suppose I just wanted to put up against that the idea of the vast historical amnesia in which I suspect a lot of people live today, in which I think that I myself live today, of not really feeling connected to or having inherited all sorts of things or anything. And I just sort of wanted to put that out there.
Good point, but notice that Baldwin, he's actually very sharp about this. He thinks memory counts for nothing. It's not a question of memory, forgotten or I have forgotten this, but this imprinting, think of Oedipus's feet being, like this, he's really ingenious in coming up with these images and how he then puts them in motion, right? Because these are the very feet that will walk Oedipus, will carry him to his fate. He does it in 2 lines. It's really brilliant. Anyway, so this imprinting has nothing to do with memory for him. So the fact that we live in an age where all of us are kind of zombies making our way through the world, to him, I think, makes very little difference, because this imprinting, at least by the lights of that essay, happens by itself in any case, right? We are thrown into history, whether we know it or not.
I would like to believe in that kind of imprinting. I'm just not sure how imprinted
I
feel
don't.
once
I don't. I find it very frightening, actually, this kind of imprint. I find it really extremely troubling. I fear that he may be right on some level, but it's not an idea. So in this sense, I'm outing myself as a liberal. In this, it's not an idea that makes me happy at all.
Okay. I would quite like to believe in it, but I'm not sure I can.
Okay. I don't know what that
ask a
outs you
question.
as.
I think Martin had something to say. Do we have? Yeah, we do have time. No, we don't. No. Okay. Okay, a little bit maybe.
Well, I've already spoken as well, so I attempted to avoid the microphone, but nonetheless.
Hoisted itself on you.
Nonetheless, exactly. But yeah, just following on from that a bit, Michel, and thank you so much, and thank you for so much, and again, thank you for Baldwin. But one of the many ways in which Baldwin is such a eloquent and important witness, so many things, and specifically in relation to this, is to do with the agonized quality of his witness. And one thing that I found very striking, particularly in the lines when he was talking about a scheme, and I have to find my own way to relate to this scheme, otherwise I will have no scheme. Now, I think what I'm interested in doing here, in a sense, is maybe kind of pushing your invocation of strangeness and so on towards something that starts to get a bit more fractious, arguably, and towards questions of polemic and antagonism between histories and schemes. Because there is also, of course, a scheme, let's say, there, that Baldwin is not mentioning. There's all of the work there's so much work in African American studies and black studies in recent decades that would absolutely emphasize, and that Baldwin writes about this brilliantly as well, of course. The what is already extremely internally variegated, internally multiple schemes that he has grown up in and with, and who writes about that better than Baldwin, and better about the dilemmas of that as well. So there's something almost rhetorically extremely interesting that's happening there then, when he's constructing this as an all or nothing.
Yes.
And in the process, in order to do that, he's also not talking about something that he does talk about quite a lot elsewhere. So I wondered if what does that say to this question of history and histories and tradition and traditions and a singular position in relation to those and degrees of agency or choice in that positioning. Thank you.
It's a very big question. I don't think I can say something coherent and worth taking your time away from tea right now about it, just out of no, seriously, because I think really the way to do it is to get very particular. I don't feel like this can be profitably treated on this level of generality. So we would then say, for example, start with Baldwin or some other passage and then get into the text of it. But I think that's the work of a seminar or a chapter, and I would just be blabbing right now to fill the time, and I don't want to do that to you. But just to thank you for the comment. Maybe, I mean, what you're saying is that maybe I have too nice an idea of what an intervention can look like, and that it can be much more contested in lots of ways. And I'm happy and willing to believe that. But without at least the license to have the contest, we would be nowhere, right? And right now, at least in the United States and in Europe, we're in a place with a notion of cultural appropriation where the very intervention is nipped in the bud. You're right. You're not supposed to even make the first gesture, let alone the 10th, that would lead to some new thing. In any case, so this was a way to try to develop a notion of cultural appropriation. And appropriation is a term that comes from Baldwin, right? I appropriate these, and we do. You have to, right? I do, and I hope you do also. To come up with a notion of cultural appropriation that is not frightened of what it does, but is also reflected, right? That is different from just doing whatever. But now I've actually taken time away from tea, finally, so apologies.